to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Worcester podcast. We are a community built on love, hope, and justice. Our goal is to inspire people to take on the challenges of a changing world. Each week we'll bring you a reflection from our minister, the Reverend Aaron Payson, recorded during our Sunday service. Maybe it'll move you, challenge your thinking, or even stir up a little righteous indignation. That's all welcome here. Thanks for listening.
I was 7 years old when I was diagnosed with Legg-Calvé-Perthes disease. For those of you who aren't familiar with the disease, it's a disease that causes the blood to stop flowing to the ball of one of your hip bones. And as that happens, the bones soften, and so the progress of the disease is to try to keep weight off of the ball of the hip bone in order that it not flatten while it's so soft. Then a third particular part of the disease is when that bone begins to reharden, and if it is flattened, it rehardens in the form of a mushroom that medical personnel call a magnococcus. 7 years old, and all of a sudden I found myself in a sling that kept my leg at a 45-degree angle from my knee back, walking on crutches. I was in second grade. Second grade is a very hard place to be when you're different from others. Shortly thereafter, I found myself in one of the most amazing contraptions I will ever have experienced in my life. It was a brace that came all the way up on my hip, and it ran a metal piece all the way down with a place at the knee to unlock it. And then at the bottom of it, there was a rubber stop and a cotter pin spring system that was kept my foot about 3 inches off the ground and put a 3-inch heel on the shoe of this other foot. The idea was to keep it from compressing, right? Except I was 7. And my mother, God love her, if she were still alive, would tell you the story about how my pediatrician, Dr. McSparron, came out of his office one day to hear this very shrill little voice calling to him from far above. Dr. McSparron, Dr. McSparron! And he looked up, and about 2 stories in the tree in front of the pediatrician's office, there was Aaron in his full glory, and his brace. 2 stories up in a tree. And Dr. McSparron was saying, "How did you get up there?" Aaron said, "How do you think?" Then he watched me climb down and hit the ground, all the while shaking his head. "You shouldn't be doing that," he said. "Yeah, well," wandered off. That summer, I was diagnosed with having a hip that had been displaced. I wonder why. And I spent a summer in a body cast after the hip had been surgically replaced, or, put back together. And after that, I had another small surgery that took the pin out that had been put in to hold it in place, and was put in what they call a Petri cast, which is casting from your hips all the way down to your ankles, and then casting a yardstick between the two and keeping you at an angle like this. So I spent the better part of 4 months in a wheelchair. Well, that's not true. About a half dozen times, my parents had to take me back to have the cast repaired because I had gotten out of the wheelchair and started to do this down the sidewalk and just crushed both sides of the cast because I was 7. Actually, I was probably 8 then. It was about this period of time when We spent the summers in New York State at my mother's family homestead, which my parents owned at the time, out in the middle of the country where, we're talking about the 70s, right? You left the house at 7 o'clock in the morning, and you came home when you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, right? But I had been laid up, and so I was bored. And I was 8. And my mother had kept encouraging me to read. Now, I love to read. In fact, I'm a bibliophile. I collect books much to the consternation of my family, right? Because that's part of what has drawn me into my profession. But at 8, not so much. She shoved a book in my hand, and she said, "I think you would enjoy this book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull." And I went, "All right." And I plopped myself in my father's chair in the middle of one very hot summer afternoon, and I began to read. Began to read about a gull that was very frustrated with his existence. Gull that was very frustrated that he couldn't figure out how to go beyond the limitations that he had set for himself or that had been set for him, limitations that seemed more physical and mental than anything else, and family who was encouraging him to just be a gull. Fly to eat. Why must you always challenge yourself to do things beyond your present capacity? And Jonathan's response is, there's got to be more to this than flying to eat. I want to learn how to fly. I want to do this my own way. I want to figure out what my purpose is and what the purpose is for living itself. Now, the 1970s was a remarkable time for religion in general and the occult in particular. We were, for the first time, really engaged in a variety of activities on a much larger scale that were beginning to challenge the mores of the mainstream religious institutions that had occupied the center of our civic life for so long. And one might accredit it to television, might accredit it to the plethora of books, but I know that, for instance, my father in the early 70s was off at places like Star Island. The summer that I was in my body cast, he took my brother to Star Island in order for my father to spend the week teaching people how to do transcendental meditation. At the end of the week, during their talent show, he was greeted by a class of people that were intoning TM in the AM means BM in the PM, all right? He very much engaged, both my parents very much engaged this culture of inner exploration, inner contemplation, the ability to come to know oneself as deep as possible, and it was very much on the outskirts, even of Unitarian Universalism at the time. The idea that one might do guided meditation was anathema in most circles. And now, if you look at almost any curricula by the UUA, guided meditation is a primary means of introducing most topics. But at the time, it was very much aligned with those who were way far out. So reading Jonathan Livingston Seagull was in some ways right up my alley because I lived in this world with my parents. But more to the point, I felt in Jonathan a kinship. Someone who had broken free of the constraints that had been placed on him by a culture, by community, by himself. And it's a fascinating turn in the story because he comes to a moment of absolute exasperation where he's been doing these dives from thousands and thousands of feet in the air, And he would get to a certain point and he would twist his wings and try to roll out of it, and he would end up tumbling into the sea. And there's this moment in Jonathan Livingston Seagull where essentially he says, I'm done. You know what? I realize now that my parents were right, the community's right. Gulls are only meant to fly in order to eat. I'm not like a falcon who can turn his wings very slightly and so forth. I'm not like this. And he starts to head towards shore. He's very exasperated with himself. He's despondent. He's disappointed. And all of a sudden, he has this epiphany. Falcons don't use their whole wings. They just use the tips. What if I pulled my wings all the way in and just used the feather at the edge? It took a radical moment of extreme disappointment to awaken in him a truth that had evaded him because he was not able to confront disappointment itself. And it was out of that awareness that he was able to come to a truth that caused him to immediately soar to, what was it, 24,000 feet in the air, some absurd amount for a gull, and to roll over and start to dive till he got to terminal velocity, which, if I remember correctly, was 214 miles an hour. The engineers in the room could tell me different, but that was about what I remember in the thing. And then he rolled over and he discovered in himself a power that he hitherto didn't understand, a power that had been energized by disappointment. The rest of the story is about him coming to terms with a community who didn't understand him either. And as one who had spent a few years in everything from a brace to a sling to a brace to a body cast to a wheelchair, I come to understand that most people look at those who are not as physically able as the rest of the world as though they are irreparably damaged. I was so wigged out by the fact that when I rolled around in my wheelchair, it was apparent that most people felt I couldn't hear. Most people felt I couldn't understand them, so they spoke very slowly. And that somehow there was something incredibly wrong with me because I didn't operate in the world like them. And maybe the most profound truth of that time in my life was this, that I learned that people do not tease out of anger, they tease out of ignorance. I learned to let go of all of the, all of the sideline conversations that I got from many peers. I had a few very close friends who didn't do that, and that taught me equally well about what it meant to be in the world. So I finished Jonathan Livingston Seagull, much to my own consternation that my mother had made me read it. And it stayed with me for years. Something of a kinship with someone who understood what it meant to be different and to learn to rely on one's own capacity. Richard Bach, the author of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and it was published in 1970. And in 2012, Richard Bach, who was a pilot, crashed his plane on the island of San Juan off the coast of Washington. He clipped wires as he was coming in to land at Friday Harbor there, and the plane turned over and landed on its roof, and he was critically injured and comatose for a number of days. 2 years later, 2014, Bach amends Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and I did not know this until I went back looking at it, amends Jonathan Livingston Seagull with a fourth section to carry the story of Jonathan Livingston Seagull beyond the moment of awareness on the part of certain numbers of seagulls about the special nature of Jonathan and their own potential because of it. It's a fascinating addition, almost a spiritual epilogue. Years after Jonathan's departure, the flock evolves into this very strange mix of gulls who embrace his teachings, perform daring aerial maneuvers, while others cling to old habits and flying only to fish. And Jonathan's message spreads thanks to some of the gulls that had decided to accompany him, including and especially Fletcher and the other quote-unquote disciples of Jonathan early on.
Thanks.
Teaching freedom through flight. And there were, to be sure, many gulls who had learned to transcend their own physical limits and vanish into higher realms and echoed Jonathan's own journey. And then section 4 says this: it was a golden age for a while. Crowds of gulls elbowed in upon Fletcher to touch the one who had touched Jonathan Livingston Seagull, a bird they now considered divine. In vain did Fletcher insist that Jonathan had only been a gull like them who had learned as they all had learned. They were after him constantly to hear Jonathan's exact words, his precise gestures, to find tiny details about him. The more they begged for trivia, the more uneasy grew Fletcher Gull. When once they had been interested in practicing the message, training and flying fast and free and glorious in the sky, now they began to slack away from difficult work and became ever so slightly wide-eyed over legends of Jonathan, as though he were an idol of a fan club. Gull Fletcher, they asked, did the magnificent Jonathan say, "We are the truth of ideas of the great Gull," or was it, "We are, in fact, the ideas of the great Gull"? Please, call me Fletcher. Just Fletcher Seagull, he would reply. Appalled, they would use the term of reverence upon him. And what difference does it make which word he used? Both are correct. We are ideas of the great Gull. But he knew that they weren't satisfied with his answer, and they thought he had dodged their question. Gull Fletcher, when the divine Gull Jonathan rose to fly, did he move one step toward the wind or two? Before he could correct the one question, another was fired. Gull Fletcher, did the sacred Gull Jonathan have gray eyes or gold eyes? The questioner, a bird with gray eyes, was in anguish for only one answer. I don't know. Forget his eyes. He had purple eyes. How can that matter? What he came to tell us was that we can fly if we would just wake up and stop standing around on the beach talking about the color of somebody's eyes. Now watch, and I'll show you a pinwheel turn. But more than one gull, finding it wearying to practice something as difficult as a pinwheel, flew home musing, the great one has purple eyes, not like my eyes, not like the eyes of any gull that ever lived. The class has changed, writes Bach, with years from wide-soaring poems in flight to hushed talk about Jonathan before and after practice, to long involved recitations on the sand about the divine one, with no flying ever done by anyone. Fletcher and the other students of Jonathan were at turns puzzled and correctful and firm and furious at the change. But they were helpless to stop it. They were honored, and worse, revered, but they were no longer heard. And the birds who practiced flying were fewer and fewer. I love that fourth section. For anyone of you who have studied the sociology of religion, it is the exact kind of analysis that occurs in any religious tradition after the founding by a charismatic leader. into the second, third, fourth generations, where it's no longer about the truth of what was expressed. It is about the idolization of the one who expressed it. It is no longer about practicing those truths. It is about revering the one who embodied those truths in a divine fashion. And if I had to say what the difference between Unitarian Universalism is for me and other traditions that it encounters, especially the traditions out of which Unitarianism and Universalist comes, which is moderate Christianity, I would say that at each turn, Unitarian Universalists and Unitarian Universalists have critiqued that out of which they have come as being idolatrous, as being the step away from the actual practice. Think about people like Emerson. I love when people come to me to talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson, because they come to me most of the time out of an introduction to Emerson as a literary figure out of the 19th century, someone whom they have read. Far too few of them understand that Emerson and the Transcendentalist movement were fundamentally a religious tirade against moderate Unitarianism at the time, and was preaching a message that fundamentally said, your God is way too small. You think that God is something that is confined to these biblical scriptures. You do not understand the power and potential of awakening to that divine spirit in nature fundamentally, in other beings fundamentally. It is not about reverencing the past that brings you closer to the divine. It is about awakening to the divine in every moment of your existence, in every person that you meet, in the potential of every environment to teach you something about yourself and about the world around you and about others. I've been thinking a lot about that this week, especially following the death of Charlie Kirk, which I know has been on the minds of many of you who have been absorbed in the media frenzy and social media frenzy that has followed the killing of Charlie Kirk in Utah. And where I have come has been a slow process. My immediate response is Charlie Kirk should never have died, should never have been killed. It's a tragedy, and it is fundamentally anathema to the way in which I believe faithful people ought to operate in the world. We do not take the life of another person because we disagree with them. And I couldn't have disagreed with Charlie Kirk more. I spent most of my youth learning how to engage in intellectual combat. I was a debater all the way through high school. I could chew on the best of them. But it was shortly after coming into college that I learned that debate is not fundamentally a means of bringing about a difference in the world. It's not even an exchange of ideas. It's really about winning a point. And if you read turning points like little submotto, prove me wrong, it's also not about the truth, it's about him. And so I've been thinking a lot this week about what it is that needs to happen in order for us to transcend this notion that somehow we're just about the exchange of ideas. And I've gone back to reviewing material on rhetoric so that I can come to a deeper awareness of the things that I learned early on about the way in which words are used in order to be able to malign, to degrade, to marginalize, and to be able to elevate certain people and certain ideas. Malign, degrade, demoralize, marginalize with words. Oh, and by the way, this is a Christian movement. more and more I'm coming to understand that fourth section of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which is more about identifying with something than about practicing it. So I come today revisiting this old story that has meant so much in my life, at a moment in my life where I am no longer able to say, oh, my hip. I'm defined by this thing that happened to me. I am confined by this thing that happened to me. And I don't yet know what that means. I do know that I have spent the last 3 weeks confusing my wife. Because now I walk without a limp and she does not recognize it, and it freaks her out. What's that? I understand. But I also understand that the difference it's made. And I think I understand a little bit of what Richard Bach went through when he had this life-changing experience that brought him back to this particular work for which he was so well known, and caused him to actually add to it. Something about confronting one's own mortality or potential that brings one back to the meditation on what is it exactly that confines me to this instead of opening me up to other possibilities. And I offer the same to you. As you think about what's transpired over the last week or the last 3 months or what's coming on, what confines you? What would it take for you to let go and to practice flying? Amen. And blessed be.
Thanks for tuning in. If you're just crossing our path, either new to this congregation or curious about Unitarian Universalism, check out our website, uucworcester.org. You'll find lots of information there about our beliefs, the 8 guiding principles, religious exploration for children and adults, our social action initiatives, and the many groups we offer to help people connect and have fun. And consider joining us, in person or online, on a Sunday morning at 10 a.m. We'd love to meet you.